Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We need to establish something immediately. Nyarlathotep does not exist. The rituals attributed to his summoning are literary inventions, fragments of a fictional cosmology created by H.P. Lovecraft and his collaborators between 1920 and 1937. This is not contested. What deserves investigation is why these fabricated ceremonies have accumulated such elaborate detail across a century of retelling, and why readers continue seeking them with the fervor of genuine occultists pursuing authentic grimoires. The rituals themselves function as narrative architecture. They appear across dozens of stories, each adding fragments, geometric formulae in The Dreams in the Witch House, object-based summoning in The Haunter of the Dark, temporal alignments in The Festival. Lovecraft constructed these not as functional instructions, but as world-building mechanisms, techniques for generating the impression of coherent, underlying reality. Yet the very precision of this construction created an unintended consequence. By 1977, commercial grimoires were publishing actual Nyarlathotep invocations. Online archives now catalog hundreds of supposed ritual variations, each claiming historical precedent. This investigation examines that slippage, the moment when literary device becomes perceived methodology. We will trace the ritual's origins in Lovecraft's correspondence and published work, analyze their philosophical function within cosmic horror tradition, and document their unexpected migration into practical occultism and urban legend. The question is not whether these rituals work. The question is why so many people have needed them to. Lovecraft wrote the prose poem Nyarlathotep in December 1920, immediately after waking from what he described in letters as the most realistic and horrible nightmare I have experienced since the age of 10. The timing matters. This was not the mature mythologist of 1930s tales like At the Mountains of Madness or The Shadow Out of Time, but a 30-year-old amateur journalist still finding his aesthetic voice. The entity emerged not from systematic world-building, but from dream imagery, a robed figure demonstrating electrical equipment to increasingly unhinged audiences before the collapse of civilization itself. Only later would Lovecraft recognize this spontaneous creation as foundational to his interconnected cosmology. The development reveals itself through correspondence. In a 1921 letter to Reinhard Kleiner, Lovecraft describes the dream's lecture hall setting, the sense of mounting dread as the demonstrations progressed, and the crawling chaos that followed. He had not yet conceived the vast pantheon of outer gods. Azathoth would not appear until 1922. Cthulhu awaited 1926. What Lovecraft possessed in 1920 was an image, a messenger figure whose presence dissolved the boundaries between rationality and nightmare. The rituals for contacting this entity would accumulate gradually across 17 years of subsequent fiction, each story adding procedural fragments that retrospectively appeared coordinated. Consider the authorial function this served. Lovecraft's cosmic horror required entities fundamentally alien to human comprehension, yet narratively such beings pose a structural problem. How do characters encounter the utterly unknowable? Nyarlathotep solved this by serving as intermediary, the sole outer god who actively sought human contact rather than remaining indifferent. Where Azathoth represented pure cosmic chaos and Cthulhu embodied imprisoned power, Nyarlathotep moved through history as manipulator and tormentor. The rituals attributed to him thus became narrative necessity, the mechanism by which human characters could mistakenly believe themselves in control while actually being instruments of incomprehensible purpose. This sophisticated framework emerged retroactively. Early appearances like the 1920 prose poem contain no ritual elements whatsoever. Nyarlathotep simply arrives, demonstrates his phenomena, and civilization collapses. The 1931 The Dreams in the Witch House would introduce geometric summoning through angles and mathematical formulae. The Haunter of the Dark in 1935 presented object-based invocation via the shining trapezohedron. Between these poles, Lovecraft constructed what appeared to be coherent summoning methodology, though he never compiled systematic instructions. The rituals exist as textual archaeology, fragments readers must reconstruct from scattered references across multiple stories. Lovecraft's letters reveal conscious artifice. Writing to Clark Ashton Smith in 1927, he discusses the importance of verisimilitude in fantasy, the technique of grounding impossible events in precisely rendered detail and pseudo-scholarly apparatus. The rituals serve this function. By presenting Nyarlathotep contact as procedural rather than arbitrary, Lovecraft created the impression of discoverable rules governing supernatural phenomena. Readers encountered not authorial caprice, but apparently consistent cosmological laws. This invited a particular kind of engagement, the attempt to systematize, to extract the underlying logic from narrative fragments. That such logic was never intended as coherent made no difference to its perceived existence. The grimoire tradition provided Lovecraft's template. Medieval texts like the Key of Solomon and the Lemegeton present elaborate ceremonial instructions, circles, incantations, proper astronomical timing, sacrificial materials. These genuine historical documents attempted to codify demon summoning through precise methodology, operating on the assumption that supernatural contact followed discoverable procedures. Lovecraft inverted this framework. Where traditional grimoires promised power through proper execution, his fictional rituals guaranteed only revelation of humanity's cosmic insignificance. The summoner's control was always illusion. Nyarlathotep came when it served his purposes, regardless of human intention. The rituals thus functioned as narrative irony, the appearance of procedure masking absolute helplessness. By 1937, the year of Lovecraft's death, Nyarlathotep had accumulated more ritual references than any other entity in his fiction. This was not systematic design, but accretion, each story adding elements that subsequent tales would reference, creating dense intertextual web. The question for later sections becomes how these literary fragments escaped their original context, migrating from Lovecraft's controlled fiction into realms their creator never anticipated. The Egyptian connection announced itself immediately in the entity's name. Nyarlathotep echoes genuine pharaonic nomenclature. The Hotep suffix appears in historical names like Amenhotep and Imhotep, meaning satisfied or at peace. Lovecraft borrowed this linguistic marker deliberately, creating what appeared to be authentic Egyptian etymology while inventing entirely fictional content. No ancient Egyptian deity bears this name. No hieroglyphic inscription references such an entity. Yet the phonetic architecture convinced readers of historical precedent, particularly those encountering Lovecraft's work without Egyptological expertise. The name performed crucial work. It suggested that these rituals had roots extending beyond modern fiction into genuinely ancient practices. This fabrication drew upon Victorian Egyptomania's popularized mythology rather than actual scholarship. The late 19th century had witnessed unprecedented public fascination with Egyptian antiquity following major archaeological discoveries. The Rosetta Stone's decipherment in 1822, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, and the subsequent flood of artifacts into European museums. By Lovecraft's era, Egyptian imagery saturated Western popular culture, always tinged with occult menace. The 1890s saw Egyptian revival architecture, seances supposedly channeling pharaonic spirits, and Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society claiming secret wisdom from Egyptian mystery schools. Lovecraft inherited this cultural moment, recognizing that readers would accept Egyptian origins for cosmic horror, precisely because Egypt already signified forbidden knowledge in popular imagination. The spiritualist movement's collapse provided another crucial context. Between 1848 and 1920, spiritualism had promised scientific proof of supernatural contact through mediumship, seances, and elaborate ceremonial procedures. By the time Lovecraft wrote Nyarlathotep, this movement faced thoroughgoing exposure. The Sabert Commission's 1887 report had documented widespread fraud. Harry Houdini spent the 1920s publicly debunking mediums, revealing the mechanical tricks behind supposedly supernatural phenomena. What had been earnest spiritual seeking revealed itself as deliberate manipulation or self-deception. Lovecraft's rituals operate in this post-spiritualist landscape. They acknowledge the desire for cosmic contact while suggesting that genuine connection brings not enlightenment, but annihilation of meaning itself. Theosophy's influence deserves particular attention. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, and subsequent theosophical writings constructed elaborate cosmological hierarchies supposedly derived from ancient sources. Tibetan masters, Egyptian priests, Atlantean records. These texts presented themselves as recovered wisdom, carefully footnoted and cross-referenced, despite being essentially invented. The technique impressed Lovecraft, who recognized its narrative power. His own approach, creating fictional grimoires like the Necronomicon and having multiple stories reference the same textual sources, directly paralleled theosophical methodology. Both systems generated authenticity through internal consistency rather than external verification. Both invited readers to piece together coherent cosmology from scattered fragments. The difference lay only in authorial intent. Blavatsky apparently believed her synthesis. Lovecraft knew exactly what he was constructing. Scientific materialism's triumph created philosophical space for Lovecraft's particular horror. The late 19th century had witnessed systematic dismantling of religious cosmology through Darwinian evolution, geological deep time, and astronomical discoveries revealing Earth's insignificance in vast cosmos. By 1920, educated readers could no longer comfortably assume humanity's central importance or divine attention. Traditional religion offered diminishing consolation. Scientific rationalism provided understanding but no meaning. Lovecraft's rituals addressed this void. They suggested that cosmic contact remained possible, but such contact would only confirm humanity's absolute insignificance and the universe's indifference. The summoner seeking knowledge would discover that no knowledge worth having exists, that comprehension itself dissolves before genuinely alien intelligence. This inverted religious ritual, instead of communion with benevolent deity, contact with entities that regarded humanity as a relevant phenomenon. The Yellow 90s decadent literature provided aesthetic framework. Writers like Oscar Wilde, Arthur Machen, and Robert W. Chambers had explored transgressive knowledge and its psychological costs. Chambers's The King in Yellow, 1895, particularly influenced Lovecraft. Its forbidden play that drove readers mad established the template of dangerous text, where mere exposure to certain ideas produced psychic contamination. Lovecraft adapted this concept to ritual. The procedures for contacting Nyarlathotep functioned as infectious information, where knowing the methodology itself constituted the first stage of corruption. Not X merely reading about rituals, but Y, the act of comprehending their logic that initiated transformation. Colonial anxiety suffused these cultural antecedents. Nyarlathotep often appeared as the Black Pharaoh, or manifested through non-European avatars, embodying early 20th century fears of colonized peoples and foreign influences corrupting Western civilization. This racist subtext, which Lovecraft's personal correspondence confirms as deliberate, positioned ritual contact as civilizational contamination. The procedures themselves supposedly originated in non-Western sources: Egyptian temples, Arabic translations, indigenous Australian practices. What modern readers must acknowledge is that Lovecraft's horror derived partly from his xenophobia, his rituals encoding the fear that engagement with non-Anglo-Saxon cultures would destroy Western rationality. Understanding this origin does not require endorsing it, but recognizing how deeply racism shaped cosmic horror's foundational texts remains essential to honest analysis. These antecedents converged in Lovecraft's work, creating conditions where fictional rituals could seem to carry historical weight despite their recent invention. The ritual functions first as authentication device. When Lovecraft describes ceremonial procedures, specific incantations, material components, astronomical timing, he generates what literary theorists call the reality effect, the accumulation of concrete detail that persuades readers of fictional events' factual basis. Consider the opening of the festival, 1923, where the narrator describes finding the old book containing the words and signs I had been told to speak and make. No incantation appears in full. No sign receives complete description. Yet the specificity of reference, this book, these words, those signs, creates impression of recoverable knowledge existing beyond the text's boundaries. Readers encounter not fabrication, but documentation. The narrator withholding information for safety, rather than because no information exists. This technique of strategic omission intensifies perceived danger. Traditional grimoires provide exhaustive instruction precisely because they assume readers will attempt replication. Lovecraft's rituals operate inversely. The shining trapezohedron in The Haunter of the Dark serves as summoning device, yet the story never explains its construction or the specific procedures for its use. Robert Blake simply gazes into it. The mathematical formulae in The Dreams in the Witch House remain incomplete. Walter Gilman's notes contain equations and diagrams and crude attempts at deciphering certain papers found in the witch house. But these appear only as described objects, never as reproducible content. The gaps suggest Lovecraft, or his fictional narrators, protecting readers from dangerous knowledge. This positions audience as potential victims rather than observers, already implicated through mere exposure to fragmentary information. The key grammar of summoning draws heavily on ceremonial magic's established vocabulary while subtly corrupting its logic. Medieval grimoires present protective methodologies, circles to contain demons, divine names to compel obedience, purification rituals to sanctify the magician. Lovecraft retains the procedural structure, but eliminates efficacy. When characters draw circles in his stories, these boundaries fail. When they recite incantations, the words summon forces they cannot comprehend, much less control. The Dreams in the Witch House demonstrates this inversion most clearly. Keziah Mason's mathematical angles and geometric figures initially seem like neutral tools, pure abstractions divorced from moral dimension. Yet these formulae open channels to spaces where Nyarlathotep and other entities move freely, and the geometry itself begins reshaping Gilman's apartment, rendering three-dimensional space unstable. The ritual framework promises mastery while delivering dissolution. Incantations in Lovecraft's work resist conventional linguistic analysis. He occasionally provides phonetic renderings. Ea, Nyarlathotep, appears across multiple stories. But these vocalizations lack the structured syntax of traditional magical languages. Compared to genuine Enochian calls or Hebrew divine names, which feature consistent grammatical rules and translatable meanings. Lovecraft's ritual phrases operate as pure signifiers, sound divorced from recoverable sense. This serves two functions simultaneously. It prevents readers from discovering that the language is meaningless, since incomprehensibility appears to be the point. It also suggests that meaning exists at levels human cognition cannot access, that the words function in dimensions beyond semantic content. The ritual participant speaks but cannot understand what they are saying. Ideal metaphor for cosmic horror's central theme of comprehension's inadequacy before genuine otherness. Material components in summoning, rituals carry symbolic weight beyond their immediate narrative function. The shining trapezohedron requires darkness to activate. Blake must extinguish all light before gazing into its depths. This inverts Enlightenment metaphors where light represents knowledge and darkness ignorance. Here, darkness enables vision, but what becomes visible destroys the observer's sanity. Similarly, Gilman's geometric summoning requires specific architectural conditions. The warped angles of the witch house itself, where non-Euclidean geometry becomes physically manifest. The building is not merely setting, but active component, its structural abnormality facilitating contact with abnormal dimensions. Lovecraft thus makes place itself ritualistic, suggesting that certain locations inherently enable supernatural access regardless of human intention. Dream logic versus waking logic provides crucial distinction in ritual function. Many of Lovecraft's most effective ceremonies occur in dream states or liminal consciousness. The original Nyarlathotep prose poem describes quasi-hallucinatory events where causality itself seems suspended. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Gilman's ritual contact happens primarily while sleeping, his physical body remaining in bed, while his consciousness travels through mathematical angles to alien spaces. This positioning allows Lovecraft to have ritual procedures that work. Characters genuinely make contact, while maintaining ambiguity about objective reality. Perhaps the rituals access actual cosmic entities. Perhaps they trigger psychological states that feel like cosmic contact. The text refuses to settle this question, and the refusal itself generates unease. If rituals work through belief rather than metaphysical efficacy, does that make them less dangerous? The unreliable ritual text appears throughout Lovecraft's work, most prominently in references to the Necronomicon. This fictional grimoire supposedly contains summoning procedures, yet different stories attribute contradictory contents to it. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, describes it as containing genealogies of the old ones and instructions for calling them. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, 1927, presents it as primarily necromantic. These inconsistencies enhance rather than undermine believability. Real medieval grimoires exist in multiple variant manuscripts, their contents shifting across translations and copyist errors. By making his fictional source texts similarly variable, Lovecraft mimics textual transmission's actual messiness. Readers encounter not impossible contradiction, but the expected behavior of ancient documents surviving through imperfect preservation. The sensory vocabulary of otherworldly contact deserves particular attention. Lovecraft rarely describes Nyarlathotep's appearance directly. The entity remains crawling chaos, shrouded figure, or geometrically impossible form. Instead, the text accumulates sensory details around contact, moments, the peculiar quality of light, unexpected odors, sounds that seem to come from wrong directions or impossible distances. The Haunter of the Dark describes a vague cloudy pattern on the floor and a sense of monstrous guilt, rather than definitive visual encounter. This technique shifts ritual's effect from observable phenomenon to psychological state, making contact something felt rather than seen. The summoner experiences transformation, but cannot articulate what has actually occurred, leaving language itself revealed as inadequate before cosmic otherness. These narrative techniques collectively construct rituals that seem to possess internal logic despite their fictional origins, preparing ground for their eventual escape from Lovecraft's intended context. The Necronomicon stands as Lovecraft's most successful authentication device, a grimoire that never existed, achieving greater cultural presence than many actual medieval magical texts. Lovecraft invented it fully for his 1924 story, The Hound, naming it Necronomicon, Book of Dead Names, and attributing authorship to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. Subsequent stories added biographical details. Al-Hazred supposedly composed the original Al-Azif in Damascus around 730 CE, died consumed by invisible monsters in broad daylight, with his text later translated into Greek by Theodorus Philetas in 950 CE, and into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228. This accumulation of specific dates, translators, and manuscript histories mimicked genuine bibliographic scholarship. Lovecraft even specified which libraries held copies: Miskatonic University's rare book collection, the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Harvard's Widener Library. The precision convinced readers who lacked means to verify these claims. Cross-referencing between Lovecraft Circle authors created dense textual verification network. When Clark Ashton Smith mentioned the Necronomicon in The Return of the Sorcerer, 1931, he treated it as established fact rather than Lovecraft's invention, adding details about its contents that Lovecraft had never specified. Robert E. Howard's The Black Stone, 1931, referenced both the Necronomicon and von Junst's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, another fictional grimoire, while adding his own fabricated text, Friedrich von Junst's Nameless Cults. Frank Belknap Long, August Derleth, and Robert Bloch each contributed additional pseudo-scholarly references. This collaborative world-building produced what seemed like independent verification. Multiple authors across different stories citing the same sources, disagreeing on minor details in ways that suggested authentic scholarly debate rather than coordinated fiction. The technique resembles documentary forgery more than traditional fiction. Consider how Lovecraft embedded ritual references within apparently scholarly apparatus. The festival includes a footnote attributing a Latin phrase to the Necronomicon, complete with book and verse citation. The Dunwich Horror quotes the grimoire directly, nor is it to be thought that man is either the oldest or the last of Earth's masters. These quotations appear in italics with precise attribution, formatted exactly like genuine textual scholarship. The visual presentation on the page reinforces authenticity, This looks like academic writing, follows scholarly conventions, and therefore carries scholarly authority. Readers approaching these stories without foreknowledge encounter what appears to be historical research incorporating supernatural elements, not pure invention. Historical layering provided temporal depth that single-period invention could not achieve. Nyarlathotep rituals supposedly existed first in Egyptian antiquity, then survived through Arabic translations, medieval Latin manuscripts, and finally modern English versions. Each transmission layer allowed Lovecraft to explain textual variations and gaps. Perhaps certain ritual components were lost in translation from Arabic to Latin. Perhaps medieval copyists deliberately obscured dangerous passages. Perhaps modern scholars misunderstood ancient contexts. This diachronic approach let him have contradictory ritual descriptions across stories while attributing contradictions to textual transmission problems rather than authorial inconsistency. The rituals gained the patina of age, the accumulated corruptions and uncertainties that characterize genuinely ancient knowledge. Geographic specificity anchored fictional events in verifiable locations, exploiting readers' inability to check every detail. The Haunter of the Dark situates the Starry Wisdom cult in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, providing specific street addresses, the Free Will Church on Starry Street. Providence exists. Federal Hill is a real neighborhood. Starry Street, however, is fictional. The ratio of verifiable to invented details weighted heavily toward truth, making readers assume all elements were factual. Similarly, Lovecraft placed ritual sites in Egypt's actual desert regions, in Australia's genuine wilderness areas, in precisely described New England towns. A reader verifying the easy claims. Yes, Arkham seems plausibly located in Massachusetts. Yes, the Nile Delta contains ancient temples. Would likely accept unverifiable claims embedded among them. The found manuscript tradition provided established literary framework. Gothic fiction had long employed discovered documents, journals, letters, ancient chronicles, to authenticate supernatural events. Lovecraft refined this by making the manuscripts themselves ritual objects. The Necronomicon is not merely a text describing rituals. It functions as summoning device, where reading particular passages constitutes invocation regardless of reader's intent. The case of Charles Dexter Ward hinges on Ward discovering Joseph Curwen's papers, which contain not just historical information, but functional, necromantic formulae. The line between reading about ritual and performing ritual collapses, making the text itself dangerous rather than merely informative. This concept would prove remarkably generative for later horror, establishing the idea of hazardous information that contaminates through exposure. Lovecraft's approach to footnotes and citations deserves particular examination. Academic writing employs footnotes to provide sources, acknowledge debts, and guide readers to supporting evidence. Lovecraft weaponized this convention. His footnotes cite non-existent books, reference fictional scholars, and provide false publication details that appear entirely plausible. A footnote in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, mentions the rare Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, alongside genuine anthropological works, mixing invention with reality in ways that obscure the boundary. Readers trained to trust footnoted material, to assume citations indicate verifiable sources, found, their scholarly habits exploited. The footnote's presence functioned as authentication, regardless of content. The bibliography of interconnected fictional texts expanded beyond Lovecraft's own contributions. His correspondents added their own grimoires, Robert Bloch's De Vermis Mysteries, Mysteries of the Worm, Clark Ashton Smith's Book of Eibon, Robert E. Howard's Unaussprechlichen Kulten. Each text supposedly contained ritual fragments for contacting various entities, with the Necronomicon serving as central source that other grimoires referenced or contradicted. This network of textual cross-reference created impression of genuine occult library, complete with scholarly disputes about proper manuscript readings and translation controversies. The fictional bibliography achieved sufficient density that researchers began treating it as actual corpus. The apparatus of scholarship, publication histories, translator biographies, manuscript variations, proved more convincing than any individual story's content. Lovecraft understood that readers would believe in systematic documentation. A single story claiming ancient ritual might be dismissed as fantasy. 20 stories across 15 years, written by multiple authors, all referencing consistent source texts with detailed provenance and publication histories, achieved different status. The rituals appeared not as one writer's invention, but as recovered knowledge that multiple investigators had independently discovered and documented. This collaborative authentication would ultimately enable the ritual's escape from fiction into spaces their creators never anticipated, as we will examine in subsequent sections. The careful construction of intertextual authenticity thus prepared ground for genuine confusion about these rituals' origins and status, blurring boundaries between literary device and perceived methodology in ways that continue producing consequences nearly a century after Lovecraft's initial inventions. Cosmic indifferentism forms the philosophical bedrock beneath every Nyarlathotep ritual. Traditional religious ceremonies assume divine attention. Prayers are heard, sacrifices acknowledged. Rituals produce communion with entities that care about human existence. Lovecraft inverted this entirely. His rituals enable contact with forces that regard humanity with the same interest a human might show toward microorganisms in a petri dish. Not hostility, but absolute disregard for human concerns, values, or survival. The summoner seeking Nyarlathotep discovers not a deity interested in worship, but an entity pursuing incomprehensible purposes to which human existence is incidental. This represents horror of a particular kind, not being destroyed by malevolent force, but recognizing one's complete irrelevance to cosmic operations. The epistemic dimension proves equally devastating. Characters perform rituals expecting revelation, the acquisition of forbidden knowledge that will elevate their understanding. What they receive instead is comprehension they cannot process. Information that dissolves rather than expands consciousness. Walter Gilman in The Dreams in the Witch House learns mathematical truths, allowing travel through higher dimensions. But this knowledge drives him toward infanticide and eventual death. Robert Blake gazes into the shining trapezohedron, seeking historical information about the Starry Wisdom cult. The visions he receives destroy his capacity for normal perception, leaving him unable to function in three-dimensional space. The rituals deliver exactly what they promise, genuine contact with cosmic reality. But human neurology proves incapable of integrating such contact without fundamental dissolution. This positions knowledge itself as corrupting rather than liberating. Enlightenment philosophy and scientific tradition both assume that understanding improves the human condition, that ignorance causes suffering while knowledge provides tools for addressing it. Lovecraft's rituals suggest the opposite. Certain knowledge destroys well-being. Certain truths unmake sanity. The characters who avoid ritual contact, who refuse to read the Necronomicon or investigate strange phenomena, survive precisely through their ignorance. wisdom becomes pathology. The investigator's curiosity functions as tragic flaw in Greek sense. The very quality that should enable flourishing instead guarantees destruction. Does this philosophical stance hold coherent position, or does it collapse into obscurantist rejection of inquiry itself? Identity dissolution operates through ritual contact at fundamental level. Characters begin as discrete individuals with stable self-concepts, coherent boundaries between self and other. The summoning process erodes these boundaries. Gilman finds his consciousness merging with Keziah Mason's, sharing her experiences across centuries, unable to determine which memories belong to his own life and which to the witches. The narrator of the festival discovers his entire identity constructed around false assumptions about his family history, his ancestry extending into non-human lineages. Nyarlathotep functions as revealer of hidden kinships. The summoner learns they were never fully human, or that humanity itself lacks the coherent category they assumed. The ritual transforms not external circumstances, but self-understanding, retroactively rewriting personal history. Teleological collapse accompanies these revelations. Humans construct meaning through narrative. Events occur for purposes. Actions pursue goals. Lives move toward destinations. Ritual contact with Nyarlathotep reveals the universe as operating without narrative logic whatsoever. Events happen as byproducts of forces pursuing non-comprehensible purposes, or as random fluctuations in cosmic chaos, or as the dreams of sleeping entities to whom human history registers as brief, meaningless flicker. The summoner seeking purpose discovers purposelessness. The investigator trying to understand cosmic order encounters fundamental disorder. This differs from nihilism, which at least maintains that meaninglessness is the truth. Lovecraft's cosmos suggests that truth and meaninglessness operate in categories alien to both concepts. The problem is not that life lacks meaning, but that meaning itself is provincial human construct, inapplicable to actual reality. The role of technology in facilitating ritual contact deserves attention. Nyarlathotep often appears demonstrating modern equipment, electrical devices in the 1920 prose poem, or enabling contact through scientific investigation in later tales. This suggests that scientific advancement, far from dispelling supernatural threat through rationality, actually increases vulnerability to cosmic forces. The more humanity learns about physics, mathematics, and dimensional theory, the closer it approaches knowledge that will dissolve rather than empower. Progress becomes movement toward precipice. The Enlightenment promise that reason would master nature inverts completely. Reason reveals nature as unmasterable, hostile to human flourishing, not through intention, but through its fundamental incompatibility with human cognitive architecture. Modernity's false promise threads through ritual narratives. The 1920s represented triumph of scientific materialism, the apparent vindication of rationalist worldview. Lovecraft's rituals operate in this context as dark mirror. They use modern knowledge, employ scientific terminology and mathematical precision, yet reveal that scientific advancement has merely provided new methods for contacting horrors that pre-scientific societies wisely avoided. The rituals appear rational, methodical, subject to empirical investigation. This rationality makes them more dangerous than traditional magical thinking, precisely because modern practitioners lack the protective skepticism that might prevent experimentation. The scientist believes in testable hypotheses and repeatable results. When ritual procedures produce consistent effects, scientific method demands continued investigation regardless of consequences. These philosophical concepts operate not as explicit themes, but as structural assumptions underlying every ritual description, shaping reader understanding even when never directly articulated. Nyarlathotep's multiplicity distinguishes him from other outer gods in Lovecraft's pantheon. Where Azathoth remains fixed as nuclear chaos at reality's center, and Cthulhu lies imprisoned beneath the Pacific, Nyarlathotep manifests in countless forms across different times and cultures. The Haunter of the Dark appears as amorphous darkness in Providence. The Black Pharaoh walks Egyptian temples. The crawling chaos spreads formless corruption. No single description captures the entity. Instead, each manifestation represents localized expression of something fundamentally protean. This narrative, flexibility serves crucial function. It allows Nyarlathotep to appear in stories set across vastly different periods and locations while maintaining coherent identity. The rituals for contacting him must therefore vary by context, adapted to cultural moment and geographic specificity. The functional ambiguity of Nyarlathotep's role prevents easy categorization. Is he messenger for more powerful entities, delivering incomprehensible communications from Azathoth or other outer gods? Or does he operate autonomously, pursuing purposes disconnected from any hierarchy? The texts refuse definitive answer. The dreams in the witch house suggests he serves greater powers, appearing at Keziah Mason's summons to witness ritual sacrifice. Yet the 1920 Nyarlathotep prose poem presents him as independent agent, his lecture demonstrations serving no apparent master. This uncertainty matters for ritual logic. If Nyarlathotep comes only when sent by higher powers, then summoning rituals contact not him, but forces beyond him. If he acts independently, then successful ritual binds no power whatsoever. The summoner merely attracts entity that comes willingly for its own purposes. Comparison to other outer gods illuminates Nyarlathotep's unique position as cosmic interface. Azathoth, described in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, as the nuclear chaos beyond angled space, remains utterly inaccessible to human contact, blind, idiotic, and completely indifferent to human existence. Cthulhu, though more comprehensible, communicates only through dreams and remains imprisoned until astronomical conditions permit his release. Yog-Sothoth exists coterminous with all space and time simultaneously, its alien geometry making direct contact immediately fatal. Nyarlathotep alone moves through human spaces, speaks in human languages when he chooses, and actively seeks human interaction. He functions as translator between impossible cosmic forces and limited human comprehension, not benevolent intermediary, but sadistic interpreter, delivering messages that destroy recipients. The avatar logic operating through Nyarlathotep's various forms suggests that no true form exists, or that true form is itself meaningless concept when applied to entities operating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each manifestation, the Black Pharaoh, the Haunter of the Dark, the Thing in the Yellow Mask, represents projection into three-dimensional space of something existing in higher dimensions. The rituals therefore contact not Nyarlathotep himself, but these projections, these shadows cast by incomprehensible original. This implies that summoning success depends not on compelling the entity, but on creating conditions where one avatar finds it useful or entertaining to manifest. The ritual's geometric configurations, temporal alignments, and sacrificial offerings function as invitation rather than compulsion. Cult structures amplify individual ritual, attempts into organized summoning operations. The Starry Wisdom Sect, in the Haunter of the Dark, maintained the shining trapezohedron for decades, accumulating knowledge about optimal viewing conditions and protective measures, which ultimately proved inadequate. The witch cult Keziah Mason joined supposedly stretched back to pre-Christian Europe, preserving geometric formulae and sacrifice protocols across centuries. These organizations suggest that successful contact requires not merely correct procedure, but sustained devotion, years of preparation, multiple attempts, gradual accumulation of experiential knowledge about what methods produce results. The solo practitioner, fumbling through fragmentary instructions, faces near certain failure or death. The cult, through trial and error across generations, develops working methodology. This makes organized religion itself horrifying. What appears as community-seeking enlightenment reveals itself as multi-generational experiment in contacting forces that will eventually destroy all participants. Intermediary entities complicate the summoning hierarchy. Brown Jenkin, the rat-like familiar serving Keziah Mason, functions as go-between, preparing Gilman for more direct contact and eventually bringing him physically through angled space to meet Nyarlathotep. The hunting horrors mentioned in The Lurking Fear, 1923, and other tales serve Nyarlathotep as mobile enforcement, pursuing those who flee from contact or destroying those who witness what should remain hidden. These lesser entities suggest ritual contact operates through stages. Initial ceremonies attract servitors, which then evaluate the summoner's suitability for more direct encounter. The progression mirrors medieval grimoire logic, where practitioners first summoned minor demons to establish credibility before attempting contact with infernal princes. Lovecraft preserved the graduated approach while removing any possibility of safety. Even the preliminary entities prove dangerous, and success means exposure to forces that make preliminary horrors seem trivial. The question of Nyarlathotep's motivation generates disturbing implications. Traditional demons seek souls, worship, or earthly power. What does an entity operating beyond human comprehension want with human contact? The stories suggest not acquisition, but entertainment. Nyarlathotep torments humans the way bored humans might torment insects, finding amusement in elaborate setups leading to inevitable destruction. The rituals become traps disguised as empowerment, offering knowledge and power while delivering only suffering. Yet this too may be anthropomorphic projection, attributing human emotions like sadism to entity for whom entertainment holds no meaning. Perhaps Nyarlathotep responds to summons simply because that's what this particular avatar does, a function rather than choice, automatic as photons bending around massive objects. The horror intensifies. Precisely through this uncertainty, the summoner cannot know whether they face malevolent intelligence or mechanical process. Whether resistance has any meaning or outcome is already determined. These entity dynamics shape ritual design. The ceremonies must account for multiplicity of form, ambiguity of purpose, and presence of intermediaries. They must function as invitations carefully calibrated to attract attention while providing no actual protection, maintaining illusion of control that makes continued practice possible despite universal catastrophic outcomes. The arc of the summoner follows predictable trajectory across Lovecraft's fiction, beginning always with curiosity framed as legitimate inquiry. Walter Gilman studies non-Euclidean geometry as mathematics student. Robert Blake investigates Federal Hill architecture as writer researching local history. Charles Dexter Ward traces his genealogy as amateur historian pursuing family origins. The initial motivation appears rational, even admirable. the expansion of knowledge, the preservation of history, the satisfaction of intellectual curiosity. Lovecraft deliberately frames these characters as educated, reasonable individuals, rather than credulous occultists seeking supernatural thrills. This establishes that vulnerability to ritual contact correlates not with ignorance, but with precisely those qualities Western culture values: analytical thinking, scholarly rigor, persistent investigation. The transition from curiosity to obsession occurs gradually, often imperceptibly to the character experiencing it. Blake finds himself returning repeatedly to the abandoned church on Federal Hill, despite growing unease. Gilman cannot stop drawing geometric diagrams even as nightmares intensify. Ward's genealogical research consumes all other interests, destroying social relationships and academic obligations. The text marks this progression through accumulating detail. Initial visits become nightly pilgrimages. Casual sketches fill entire notebooks. Ordinary research expands into monomaniacal focus. Yet from inside the process, each step appears justified as necessary continuation of previous work. The investigator does not recognize obsession as pathology, but experiences it as deepening commitment to important questions. Only external observers, family members, colleagues, physicians, perceive the deterioration, and their concerns register to the affected character as ignorant interference with crucial work. Madness in these narratives functions ambiguously as both symptom and insight. Traditional psychiatric models treat delusion as false belief, contradicting observable reality. Lovecraft's ritual practitioners develop beliefs that external observers classify as delusional. Geometric angles allowing travel through higher dimensions, ancient entities manipulating human history, one's own ancestry extending into non-human species. Yet the text suggests these beliefs correspond to actual conditions. Gilman's mathematical insights prove functionally accurate. He genuinely travels through spaces inaccessible to normal humans. Ward correctly identifies his ancestors' necromantic practices and successfully replicates them. The psychiatric diagnosis of madness becomes itself questionable. Perhaps sanity consists of protective limitation, the inability to perceive actual reality. Perhaps madness means perceiving too clearly, cognitive architecture adapted for consensus reality failing when exposed to conditions beyond that narrow band. This creates cruel paradox for characters. If they accept psychiatric framing, they must reject experiences they've undergone as hallucination, dismissing genuine discoveries as illness. If they trust their experiences, they must reject social consensus about reality, isolating themselves from all corrective feedback. Neither option offers viable path forward. Gilman seeks help from physicians but cannot explain his condition in terms they'll accept. Mentioning travel through higher dimensions produces diagnosis of schizophrenia rather than assistance. Ward conceals his discoveries from everyone, recognizing that sharing them would result in institutionalization. The ritual practitioner becomes epistemically trapped, possessing knowledge they cannot communicate without being classified as demented, unable to return to previous ignorance, but equally unable to function with new understanding. Dreams function as preparatory space where ritual contact begins before conscious participation. The 1920 Nyarlathotep operates entirely in quasi-dream state, boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness dissolved. Gilman's geometric visions commence during sleep, only gradually intruding into waking hours. This progression suggests ritual operates through psychological infiltration. The entity or force accessed begins shaping consciousness from within, preparing the mind for more direct contact. Sleep removes rational defenses, critical thinking that might reject impossible perceptions. The dreamer accepts contradictions, impossible geometries, violations of natural law that waking consciousness would reject. By the time ritual contact occurs during waking hours, the mind has already been restructured to accommodate it, resistance eroded through cumulative exposure. Genealogical predisposition appears across multiple stories, suggesting ritual vulnerability transmits through bloodlines. The festival reveals the narrator's family has participated in underground ceremonies for generations. Ward discovers his ancestor, Joseph Kerwin, practiced necromancy, and this ancestral connection somehow facilitates Ward's own success with recovered rituals. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, makes this biological transmission explicit. Certain lineages carry non-human ancestry that eventually manifests, drawn out through exposure to appropriate conditions or locations. The implication disturbs. Ritual contact may be less choice than destiny. Genetic legacy, determining who can successfully perform ceremonies. The practitioner believes themselves exercising free will in pursuing forbidden knowledge when actually fulfilling hereditary pattern established centuries earlier. Artists and intellectuals demonstrate particular vulnerability, their professional sensitivities becoming liabilities. Poets perceive correspondences others miss. Musicians hear tonal relationships suggesting impossible harmonies. Visual artists recognize geometric patterns in seemingly random configurations. These heightened perceptual abilities, cultivated through years of training, valued by society as marking creative genius, become vectors for ritual contact. The entity accessed exploits precisely those capacities that make artists valuable, turning aesthetic sensitivity into supernatural antenna. Lovecraft himself embodied this anxiety, his own literary production depending on exactly the kind of imaginative engagement with darkness that his fiction presents as dangerous. The writer documenting forbidden rituals participates in their transmission, becomes unwitting priest spreading the very contamination he warns against. The survivor's burden appears in those few characters who escape direct contact but carry residual effects. They report permanent alterations in perception, seeing angles in architecture that disturb without clear reason, experiencing temporal dislocations where causality seems reversed, feeling presences in empty spaces. More devastatingly, they possess knowledge they cannot forget, yet cannot productively use. Knowing that certain rituals work provides no benefit when performing them guarantees destruction. Knowing that Nyarlathotep exists and moves through human civilization offers no protection, only the burden of awareness. These survivors often choose silence, recognizing that sharing their knowledge will either be dismissed as madness or, worse, inspire others to attempt the same rituals. They live as witnesses to others' inevitable repetition of their mistakes, unable to prevent what they know will occur. The psychological deterioration traced through these narratives thus operates on multiple registers simultaneously: individual madness, hereditary predisposition, professional vulnerability, and epistemic isolation all compound to produce comprehensive dissolution of self. The ritual does not simply contact external entity. It fundamentally restructures the practitioner's consciousness, making return to previous psychological state impossible, even if physical survival occurs. The forbidden text motif operates as central mechanism through which rituals propagate. The Necronomicon is not merely a book about dangerous entities, but a book that itself endangers readers. Exposure to its contents initiates transformation regardless of reader intention. the act of comprehending certain passages constitutes the ritual's first stage. The Dunwich Horror makes this explicit when describing how even reading the Latin text aloud can summon entities, the words themselves functioning as invocations. The book becomes mimetic hazard in modern terminology, information that harms through transmission. This inverts typical library logic, where books preserve safe knowledge. Here, preservation itself poses threat. The responsible course would be destroying all copies, yet Lovecraft's characters invariably choose to maintain texts for scholarly purposes, ensuring continued access and inevitable future catastrophes. Translation functions as a particularly dangerous form of engagement. The Necronomicon exists in multiple linguistic versions: original Arabic al-Azif, Greek translation, Latin rendering, suppressed English edition. Each translation supposedly requires translator to deeply comprehend source material, spending years parsing archaic grammar and obscure terminology. This extended intimate engagement with content produces exactly the psychological preparation ritual contact requires. Theodorus Philetas, who rendered the text into Greek in 950 CE, allegedly went mad during the process. Olaus Wormius, the Latin translator, died under mysterious circumstances shortly after completion in 1228. The act of translation cannot remain neutral scholarly work when the material translated itself operates as psychological contaminant. Every translator becomes unwitting practitioner, their linguistic work doubling as ceremonial procedure. Partial revelation defines Lovecraft's narrative strategy. Stories provide fragments, a ritual's opening incantation, but not its completion. The materials required, but not their preparation method. The astronomical timing without the accompanying geometric configurations. The festival describes a ceremony witnessed but never fully explained. I saw the body spread out on the stone altar, and I saw the nameless thing that crept forth from the sea. What exactly was seen? What occurred during the ceremony itself? The text withholds these details, frustrating readers seeking complete understanding. This frustration serves dual purpose. Narratively, it maintains horror through suggestion rather than explicit description. Metafictionally, it protects readers from information Lovecraft frames as genuinely dangerous. If rituals work through knowledge transmission, then incomplete knowledge provides incomplete transmission, potentially breaking the chain. The witness account problem complicates every ritual narrative. Stories arrive as first-person testimonies from participants or observers, yet these witnesses are by definition compromised. If they survived ritual contact, their sanity remains questionable. If they died, the account must come from discovered manuscripts, raising authenticity questions. The statement of Randolph Carter, 1920, exemplifies this structure. Carter reports his friend Harley Warren's death during underground exploration, but admits to memory, gaps, and psychological deterioration. Did events occur as Carter describes? Has trauma distorted his recollection? Might Carter himself be unreliable narrator, complicit in Warren's fate while consciously denying involvement? The text provides no external verification, leaving readers dependent on testimony from source that may be fundamentally untrustworthy. This creates recursive uncertainty about ritual efficacy. Perhaps the ceremonies described throughout Lovecraft's work actually function as written, producing genuine supernatural contact. Perhaps they're delusions of disturbed individuals, and the horror lies in psychological deterioration rather than cosmic entities. Perhaps, most disturbingly, the distinction collapses, rituals working through belief in ways that make genuine supernatural versus psychological projection, a meaningless binary. If performing certain procedures produces consistent alterations in consciousness that feel indistinguishable from supernatural contact, does the metaphysical status of those entities matter? The practitioner experiences contact, undergoes transformation, and suffers consequences regardless of whether Nyarlathotep really exists in ontologically robust sense. Replication anxiety haunts both characters within stories and Lovecraft as author. Characters fear that describing rituals enables their replication. Ward burns Kerwin's papers after reading them, recognizing their danger, yet having already extracted key information. Lovecraft himself expressed this tension in correspondence, discussing whether publishing cosmic horror stories might inadvertently provide instructions to unstable readers. The concern proves justified by subsequent history. The Simon Necronomicon in 1977 and various Internet-era working grimoires demonstrate that fictional rituals do migrate into attempted practice. By documenting procedures in sufficient detail to seem plausible, Lovecraft created template others would follow. The writer's paradox emerges. The story must provide enough detail to seem real, but sufficient detail enables replication by readers who mistake fiction for instruction manual. Gaps and lacunae function as narrative weights, absences that draw attention precisely through being absent. When The Dreams in the Witch House mentions Keziah Mason's certain formulae without providing them, readers focus on those missing formulae more intensely than on any provided detail. The human mind compulsively attempts to complete patterns, generating content for gaps even when text deliberately withholds it. Lovecraft exploited this tendency, recognizing that suggested horror exceeds described horror. Readers will imagine content worse than anything explicit description could deliver. The missing ritual components thus become sites of imaginative investment, each reader mentally completing the procedures according to their particular anxieties and obsessions. The rituals exist not as fixed textual content, but as collaborative construction between author's fragments and reader's elaboration. The textual transmission chain mirrors disease vectors in epidemiological models. A text containing ritual knowledge infects its reader with that knowledge. The reader, now infected, may transcribe portions of the ritual into their own writing: diary entries, scholarly articles, fictional stories. These secondary texts, containing fragments of the original information, infect their readers in turn. Across generations, the ritual knowledge propagates through textual reproduction, each iteration potentially degrading accuracy, yet maintaining enough signal to produce effects. The Necronomicon itself supposedly survived through exactly this process: fragmentary copies, corrupted translations, partial transcriptions, all preserving sufficient content to enable contact despite textual deterioration. Information proves remarkably persistent, especially information that actively seeks preservation, through psychologically hooking its carriers. The strategic omission as protective measure appears repeatedly, but fails consistently. Characters believe they're protecting others by withholding complete ritual instructions or destroying source texts. Yet, the partial information they allow to circulate proves sufficient for determined seekers to reconstruct procedures. Ward tries to conceal his discoveries, but leaves enough evidence that the investigating physicians reconstruct significant portions of what occurred. Blake's diary entries, found after his death, provide future investigators with precise enough information to locate the shining trapezohedron and potentially repeat his mistakes. The impulse toward documentation, the scholarly habit of recording findings, conflicts with safety requirements. Complete secrecy would require destroying all evidence, including one's own memories. Yet, the knowledge compels documentation, creates irresistible desire to preserve discoveries even when preservation guarantees future repetitions of catastrophe. These structural features position readers as already implicated in ritual transmission. By reading Lovecraft's stories, comprehending their ritual descriptions, and maintaining cultural memory of these procedures, contemporary audiences participate in exactly the textual propagation patterns the stories themselves warn against. The rituals survive not despite, but because of warnings, their dangerous nature making them memorable precisely when safety would require forgetting. The prose poem Nyarlathotep emerged from Lovecraft's December 1920 nightmare with remarkable immediacy, written, according to his letters, within hours of waking. The text reads as fever dream transcribed, its narrative coherence deliberately fragmented. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. The entity appears first as lecturer demonstrating electrical phenomena to urban audiences, his presentations inducing mass hysteria that spreads citywide. No ritual summons him. He simply arrives, announced through newspapers like any visiting performer. This original version lacks the elaborate ceremonial procedures later stories would develop. Nyarlathotep manifests through modernity's communication networks, telegraphs, newspapers, lecture circuits, suggesting that technological infrastructure itself enables his movement through civilization. The poem establishes patterns subsequent stories would elaborate. Nyarlathotep operates through corrupted enlightenment, offering demonstrations that appear scientific, yet produce psychological collapse. The narrator and crowds follow him willingly, even enthusiastically, recognizing danger but compelled forward. We followed and were following still, the text repeats, capturing obsessive momentum that overrides self-preservation. This voluntary participation becomes template for ritual logic. Summoners will pursue contact despite recognizing its danger, will continue procedures even as evidence of catastrophe accumulates. The entity need not compel. Human curiosity suffices. The 1920 poem contains no protective circles, no binding spells, no illusion of control. Audiences simply watch demonstrations until civilization collapses, and through the luminous clouds, I saw that the city was no longer there. The Rats in the Walls, 1923, provides early example of hereditary ritual connection, though not explicitly involving Nyarlathotep. The protagonist discovers his ancestral estate conceals underground temple, where his family conducted ceremonies for centuries, maintaining cult practices beneath veneer of civilization. The architecture itself preserves ritual function. Chambers carved in specific configurations, altars positioned according to unknown principles, passages descending through geological strata into pre-human depths. When the protagonist enters these spaces, ancestral memories activate genetic legacy overriding individual identity. He begins speaking Latin, then medieval English, eventually devolving into proto-language as consciousness regresses through evolutionary history. The ritual site operates automatically, its configuration triggering transformation in anyone carrying appropriate bloodline, regardless of conscious intention. The festival, 1923, introduces explicit ceremony while maintaining strategic ambiguity about what occurs. The narrator attends winter solstice gathering of his ancestral line, following robed figures into subterranean spaces beneath Kingsport. The ritual participants read from an unspecified book containing words and signs I had been told to speak and make. suggesting instruction received through dreams or inherited memory rather than conscious study. The ceremony summons entities from the sea, though their exact nature remains unclear. I saw the body spread out on the stone, and the altar was not empty. The text refuses detailed description, maintaining horror through implication. Significantly, the narrator never claims to have sought this knowledge or pursued ritual practice. He simply answered ancestral summons, compelled by genealogical obligation rather than occult ambition. These early texts establish intertextual cross-referencing that later stories would intensify. The festival mentions both the Necronomicon and the Book of Ibon, positioning these grimoires as source texts containing ceremony details the narrative withholds. This created template for other writers, reference Lovecraft's fictional libraries, add details he omitted, build apparent scholarly consensus through multiple authors citing same sources. Robert E. Howard's The Black Stone, 1931, references von Junst's unaussprechlichen Kulten while mentioning Lovecraft's invented texts, creating appearance of independent verification. When Clark Ashton Smith had characters consult the Book of Ibon in The Door to Saturn, 1932, he treated it as established source requiring no explanation, assuming reader familiarity from previous references across multiple authors' works. The Fungi from Yog-Sothoth sonnet cycle, 1929-30, contains fragmentary ritual references distributed across 36 poems. Sonnet Dex Night Gaunts describes entities serving Nyarlathotep, though never naming him directly. They do not show themselves to mortals plain, but merely gloom and glide and glance and grin. Sonnet Vanithorfer Azathoth positions that entity as nuclear chaos while suggesting Nyarlathotep serves as its messenger or interpreter. The poetic form enforces brevity, each sonnet providing glimpses rather than complete accounts. This fragmentation across poetic sequence mirrors how ritual knowledge supposedly survives, scattered references in different sources, requiring dedicated reader to compile comprehensive picture from distributed fragments. The scholar gathering these textual pieces performs mental equivalent of ritual preparation, assembling components into coherent whole. The cumulative effect across these foundational texts created mythological density without systematic organization. Lovecraft never compiled definitive guide to his entities or their summoning procedures, instead allowing details to accrete organically across stories. This approach generated productive ambiguity. Readers could construct multiple interpretations from available evidence, none definitively confirmed or rejected by authorial statement. The rituals existed as possibilities supported by textual fragments rather than facts established by authoritative source. This would prove crucial for later appropriation. The absence of canonical version meant anyone could claim their interpretation represented authentic tradition, filling gaps Lovecraft deliberately left open. The Haunter of the Dark appeared in the December 1936 issue of Weird Tales, written as tribute to Robert Bloch and incorporating Providence, locations Lovecraft knew intimately. The story positions ritual contact as consequence of investigation rather than intention. Robert Blake never seeks to summon anything, merely to understand the abandoned free will church on Federal Hill and its mysterious occupants, the Starry Wisdom sect. This reframing proves crucial. The most dangerous rituals are those performed accidentally by researchers who believe themselves safely documenting historical phenomena. Blake's scholarly distance collapses precisely because he maintains it too long, treating dangerous objects as mere artifacts until recognition comes too late. The Starry Wisdom cult's history provides ritual framework extending across continents and centuries. Founded in 1844 by Professor Enoch Bowen after his return from Egypt, the sect supposedly discovered the shining trapezohedron in a Cairo underground temple, identifying it as pre-human artifact far older than Egyptian civilization. The cult maintained it for decades in Providence's Free Will Church, using the stone for visions they recorded in fragmentary documents Blake later discovers. The cult dispersed in 1877, following member disappearances and mounting public suspicion, abandoning the church, but leaving the trapezohedron sealed within its steeple. Lovecraft provides precise dates, 1844, 1877, and real Providence locations, grounding fantastic content in verifiable geography. Federal Hill exists. The Italian immigrant community Lovecraft describes occupied that neighborhood. Only the Free Will Church and its contents are fictional, inserted into authentic historical matrix. The shining trapezohedron itself functions as object-based summoning device requiring minimal active procedure. Unlike elaborate ceremonies with multiple components, this ritual demands only gazing into the stone's depths under conditions of total darkness. It was a window on all time and space, the cult's records claim, allowing viewers to witness any moment across cosmic history. Yet this visual access operates bidirectionally. Looking through the window allows something to look back. The entity imprisoned within or accessed through the trapezohedron is explicitly identified as Avatar of Nyarlathotep, specifically the Haunter of the Dark, that which walketh in the lonely places and is feared by all who have wisdom. The simplicity of contact procedure, darkness plus observation, makes this among the most accessible and therefore most dangerous rituals in Lovecraft's corpus. No specialized knowledge required, no precise timing, no rare materials, only curiosity and darkness. Blake's gradual entanglement demonstrates how observation becomes participation. Initially, he simply photographs the abandoned church from his apartment window, artist's interest in architectural decay. This leads to breaking into the building, justified as historical preservation. Inside, he finds the cult's sealed archives and begins reading their fragmentary accounts of visions and visitations. Each stage feels justified by previous discoveries. Having come this far, abandoning investigation would waste prior effort. Standard sunk cost reasoning propels him forward until he locates the trapezohedron in the steeple's highest room and, despite explicit warnings in the cult's papers, looks into it. The progression mirrors addiction pathology. Initial recreational engagement becomes compulsive need, each exposure requiring deeper involvement to achieve previous effect. The diary entries. Blake leaves document accelerating deterioration following his initial gaze into the stone. He reports intrusive visions continuing even away from the church, the trapezohedron's revelations bleeding into normal perception. Specific passages record his growing awareness that something now watches him in return. I have seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror unheeded, without knowledge or luster or name. His prose shifts from scholarly notation toward fragmentary poetry, rational discourse giving way to non-linear association. More disturbingly, he develops photophobia, inability to tolerate bright light, requiring him to keep his apartment darkened. The entity accessed through darkness apparently reshapes its contactors toward conditions favoring its manifestation. Blake's increasing need for darkness creates environment where the haunter can emerge more fully into physical space. The climactic sequence occurs during an electrical storm that blacks out Federal Hill, removing the electric lighting that had protected Blake since his initial contact. The diary entries become increasingly frantic as darkness falls. I see it, coming here, hell wind, titan blur, black wings, Yog-Sothoth save me, the three-lobed burning eye. The text breaks off. When police investigate Blake's death, they find him at his window, facing the church steeple, his features twisted in terminal horror, and his body bearing a certain touch of strange alienage. The autopsy reveals no conventional cause of death, no trauma, poison, or disease. Whatever killed Blake operated through mechanisms medical science cannot classify, suggesting death occurred through exposure to impossible conditions rather than any recognized pathology. The ambiguous ending leaves multiple interpretations available. Perhaps the haunter physically emerged during the blackout and killed Blake through direct contact. Perhaps Blake died from psychological shock of witnessing its full manifestation. Perhaps, most disturbingly, Blake did not die but was transformed, his body remaining while consciousness was extracted or displaced. The strange alienage noted in the corpse suggests alteration rather than simple death, body changed by proximity to entity that should not exist in three-dimensional space. Lovecraft refuses to settle this uncertainty, recognizing that definitive explanation would reduce horror to comprehensible threat. The ritual's consequence remains multiply interpretable, preventing readers from achieving comfortable distance through complete understanding. The story's final paragraph reports that the shining trapezohedron has vanished from the church steeple, taken by persons unknown who broke into the building shortly after Blake's death. This detail extends threat beyond narrative closure. The object remains in circulation, available for future discoverers to repeat Blake's fatal investigation. The ritual can and will recur, each iteration producing similar results while maintaining illusion that this time the investigator will maintain control, that this time observation will remain safely unidirectional. The story thus documents not isolated incident, but repeatable procedure, template for indefinite future catastrophes. The dreams in the witch house appeared in the July 1933 Weird Tales, representing Lovecraft's most sustained engagement with mathematical ritual. Walter Gilman, mathematics and folklore student at Miskatonic University, rents an attic room in Arkham's notorious witch house, where Keziah Mason lived before her 1692 disappearance from Salem jail. The room's geometry proves fundamentally wrong. Angles fail to conform to Euclidean principles. Walls meet at mathematically impossible configurations. Corners exist in positions that three-dimensional space should not permit. Gilman initially dismisses local superstitions as ignorant misunderstanding of merely unusual architecture. This rationalist dismissal, the educated urbanite's contempt for rural folklore, becomes his fatal error. The angles are wrong, and their wrongness serves specific function. Keziah Mason's historical witchcraft trial provides ritual's documented origin. Court records supposedly describe how Mason told Judge Hathorne of lines and curves that could be made to point out directions leading through the walls of space to other spaces beyond, and had implied that such lines and curves were frequently used at certain midnight meetings in the dark valley of the White Stone. The geometric formulae Mason possessed predated European settlement, allegedly learned from indigenous peoples who themselves received them from non-human sources. This layering, colonial witch accessing pre-colonial knowledge derived from pre-human mathematics, positions the ritual as fundamentally alien to human culture. surviving through transmission chains that periodically allow its rediscovery. Mason's disappearance from locked cell without trace suggests successful use of these formulae, her physical escape occurring through dimensional bypass rather than conventional means. Brown-Jenkin functions as intermediary creature enabling graduated contact. Described as rat-like, but with disturbingly human face and hand-like paws, this familiar survived from Mason's original era, witnessed across centuries by various tenants of the witch house. Jenkin appears initially in Gilman's dreams, then begins manifesting during waking hours, its presence marking erosion of boundaries between sleeping and conscious states. The creature speaks in human voice of a somewhat querulous tenor, delivering messages in archaic English and demonstrating intelligence far exceeding animal capacity. Jenkin operates as messenger and guide, preparing Gilman for more substantial contact by acclimating him to impossible beings, making the subsequent encounter with Nyarlathotep feel like logical progression rather than categorical leap into unreality. Dream travel constitutes the primary ritual space in this narrative. Gilman's mathematical studies, combined with the room's non-Euclidean geometry, enable his consciousness to navigate higher dimensions during sleep. He finds himself moving through colored, chaotic voids toward a certain violet-lit gulf, where Keziah Mason maintains her presence centuries after her body's disappearance or transformation. These journeys feel more real than waking life, possessing sensory richness and coherent causality that mundane existence lacks. The inversion disturbs. Perhaps physical reality is the impoverished state, normal consciousness a restriction, and the ritual spaces accessed through dreams represent genuine expansion. Gilman begins valuing dream travel over ordinary experience, seeking sleep with addict's desperation, because his true life occurs in dimensional interstices rather than Arkham's material streets. The Walpurgis night ceremony represents convergence of multiple ritual threads. April 30th's astronomical and folkloric significance, the night when barriers between worlds supposedly thin, provides temporal framework. Keziah Mason and Brown-Jenkin physically retrieve Gilman from his bed, transporting him through angled space to the ultimate abyss, where cosmic entities congregate. The ceremony's participants include Mason, Jenkin, and a tall, lean man of dead black coloration, later identified as Nyarlathotep's Black Pharaoh avatar, along with assembled coven members apparently drawn from across centuries. The ritual requires infant sacrifice, the child's death serving purposes Gilman cannot comprehend, but recognizes as monstrously wrong. His resistance proves futile. Mason guides his hand holding the sacrificial knife, his body performing actions his conscious will opposes. Involuntary participation generates the story's moral horror. Gilman never sought these ceremonies, never desired contact with cosmic entities, actively resists when understanding dawns. Yet the room's geometry has already restructured his consciousness, months of exposure preparing neural architecture for ritual function, regardless of his preferences. When Mason seizes his hand during the sacrifice, she exploits prior conditioning. His dreams have trained his body to respond to certain geometric configurations, particular angles triggering automatic movements. The ritual has been performed. Through him, rather than by him, his agency revealed as illusory. This removes the consolation of moral choice. Gilman cannot claim that better decisions would have produced different outcome, since the outcome was determined by conditions established before he recognized danger. The story's conclusion attempts escape, but achieves only partial success. Gilman struggles back to physical reality, his hand still gripping the knife, apparently having used Mason's own techniques to return through dimensional angles. He attempts destroying his mathematical notes and sealing the room's angles with plaster, desperate remediation that arrives too late. Brown-Jenkin kills him days later, gnawing through his chest to reach his heart. The creature's attack, apparently retribution for his resistance during the Walpurgis ceremony. Yet Gilman's death occurs in normal space, witnessed by other tenants, his body remaining physically present rather than disappearing like Mason. This suggests partial success. He escaped the ritual dimension, but not its consequences, maintained material existence while failing to protect that existence from supernatural retaliation. The witch house itself suffers destruction shortly after Gilman's death, when the plaster he applied reveals certain fragments of bone within the walls, remains of previous victims, their bones positioned to reinforce the building's geometric function. The house is demolished, its angles finally obliterated through prosaic means. Yet Lovecraft notes that the site remains disturbed, local people avoiding the lot, children reporting strange dreams when playing nearby. The ritual space's destruction does not eliminate its effects. The location retains trace contamination, dimensional thinness persisting even after material structures removal. The mathematics Gilman studied continue circulating through academic channels, his notes supposedly destroyed, but the knowledge already transmitted to other scholars. The ritual survives its participants and physical site, information persisting through networks that ensure eventual rediscovery and repetition. August Derleth's post-Lovecraft systematization fundamentally altered the ritual's conceptual framework, though not necessarily their narrative function. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth assumed role of literary executor and primary mythos custodian, publishing numerous posthumous collaborations based on Lovecraft's fragmentary notes. His most consequential intervention involved imposing dualistic structure onto Lovecraft's cosmology, elder gods representing benevolent order versus outer gods embodying malevolent chaos. This Christianized framework contradicted Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism, replacing meaningless universe with moral battleground. Derleth's rituals therefore acquired protective dimensions absent from original works, ceremonies invoking elder signs to ward off outer gods, counterspells neutralizing summoning attempts, systematic hierarchies determining which entities could be safely contacted versus those requiring elaborate safeguards. Where Lovecraft's rituals offered only illusion of control, Derleth's suggested genuine magical agency. Practitioners could theoretically master procedures and achieve positive outcomes. This transformation proves most evident in Derleth's The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, published as Lovecraft collaboration despite minimal source material. The novel presents elaborate ritual sequences with step-by-step instructions, protective measures that actually function, and successful banishment of outer god manifestations through application of proper countermeasures. Characters consult the Necronomicon and extract useful defensive information rather than succumbing to its content's psychological contamination. The ritual practitioner becomes potential hero rather than inevitable victim, cosmic horror diluted into containable supernatural threat. Subsequent writers, working within Derleth's framework, inherited this structure. Their stories featuring rituals as plot devices that could be successfully navigated through knowledge and preparation, rather than inherently catastrophic procedures. Robert Bloch's contributions maintained closer fidelity to Lovecraft's original pessimism while adding significant ritual innovations. His The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, written during Lovecraft's lifetime, introduced concept of ritual reciprocity, the summoning procedure that brings entity into our reality simultaneously creates obligation for summoner to eventually serve that entity in its own dimension. The protagonist successfully summons creature that kills his colleague, seemingly achieving desired outcome, only to later realize the ritual established permanent connection. The summoner becomes marked, claimed, inevitably destined for reciprocal journey into spaces where human survival proves impossible. This concept enriched ritual logic by introducing delayed consequences, suggesting that apparent success might be stage one of extended entrapment. Frank Belknap Long's The Hounds of Tindalos, 1929, presented temporal rather than spatial summoning, expanding ritual possibility space beyond conventional geographic conjuration. Long's protagonist, Halpin Chalmers, uses drug-induced altered consciousness to project awareness backward through evolutionary time, attempting to witness pre-human eras. The procedure works, but attracts entities existing in time's angles, creatures that move through temporal rather than spatial dimensions, hunting across chronology rather than geography. This established precedent for rituals accessing non-spatial dimensions, ceremonies involving consciousness projection, temporal navigation, or perception alteration rather than physical summoning. Long's innovation influenced later writers to explore ritual as primarily psychological or perceptual operation, contact occurring through consciousness modification rather than entity materialization. The gaming influence, particularly the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, launched in 1981, produced unexpected systematization. Game mechanics required quantifiable ritual procedures, spell difficulty levels, casting times, material costs, success probability calculations. Designer Sandy Peterson and subsequent contributors compiled Lovecraft's scattered references into comprehensive grimoire, the Necronomicon supplement providing specific rules for dozens of summoning procedures. This gamification paradoxically enhanced rituals' perceived authenticity through mechanical precision. Players memorized incantations, debated optimal timing for ceremonies, and strategized about protecting against backlash effects. The rituals acquired gameplay function, actual procedures participants performed, though in fictional context, generating experiential knowledge that felt more concrete than merely reading about ceremonies in stories. Contemporary revivals demonstrate continued evolution while grappling with Lovecraft's problematic legacy. Thomas Ligotti's approach in works like The Last Feast of Harlequin, 1990, strips ritual of any efficacy whatsoever, presenting ceremonies as purely psychological manifestations that nevertheless produce genuine horror through participants' belief. His protagonists encounter groups performing elaborate rites that accomplish nothing supernatural, yet destroy participants through conviction of their metaphysical significance. This meta-horror, the terror of meaningless ritual treated as meaningful, comments on both Lovecraft's original ambiguity and Derleth's artificial systematization. Ligotti suggests that ritual's power lies entirely in psychological investment rather than cosmic connection, yet this recognition provides no protection. Knowing the ceremony is empty does not prevent the destruction participating in it produces. Laird Barron's neo-Lovecraftian fiction, particularly the Imago sequence, 2005, updates ritual for contemporary contexts while maintaining original philosophical pessimism. His stories feature corporate entities conducting systematic research into cosmic horror phenomena, applying scientific methodology to supernatural investigation. Rituals become reproducible experimental protocols, documented in technical reports with control groups and statistical analysis. This corporate scientific framing suggests that modernity's rationalization of the irrational, the attempt to standardize and control even cosmic horror through bureaucratic procedures, represents its own form of summoning ritual. The Foundation grant funding Outer God Research, the peer-reviewed paper describing entity manifestation, the government contract for weaponizing interdimensional contact, all function as contemporary ritual, ceremony dressed in institutional legitimacy. The question of fidelity to Lovecraft's vision becomes impossible to definitively answer. His own approach evolved across 17 years, early works contradicting later stories, letters revealing authorial uncertainty about his creation's nature. No canonical version exists against which to measure variations. Derleth's systematization violated cosmic indifferentism, but provided framework enabling mythos continuation. Gaming supplements betrayed original ambiguity, yet generated unprecedented engagement with source material. Contemporary writers acknowledging Lovecraft's racism while building on his cosmic horror navigate complex relationship with problematic foundation. The rituals have become collaborative mythology, each generation adapting procedures to address their particular anxieties while claiming connection to originating texts. This evolutionary process mirrors how actual ritual traditions develop across centuries. Practices accumulate variations. Theological interpretations shift. Procedures adapt to new contexts while maintaining claims of ancient authenticity. The difference is that we can trace Nyarlathotep ritual's invention to specific 1920s texts by identifiable author, yet this knowledge has not prevented their treatment as genuinely ancient procedures by subsequent practitioners and writers. The collaborative expansion reveals something about human relationship with fictional frameworks. Sufficient aesthetic power can override known fabrication. Communities forming around openly invented mythologies and treating them with seriousness usually reserved for historical traditions. The rituals live not despite, but through their fictional origins, their literary construction enabling precisely the kind of cultural propagation that would be impossible for genuinely ancient, fixed ceremonial texts. The first significant breach between fiction and perceived reality occurred in the 1960s, when library requests for the Necronomicon became sufficiently common that institutions began issuing formal statements about the book's non-existence. Yale's Sterling Memorial Library, Brown's John Hay Library, and the British Library all faced repeated inquiries from patrons seeking to examine this supposedly rare manuscript. Some librarians responded with humor, creating mock catalog entries or fictional acquisition dates. Others treated the situation more seriously, recognizing that requesters genuinely believed they were seeking historical document rather than literary invention. The pattern revealed fascinating cultural phenomenon. Lovecraft's authentication techniques had worked too well, convincing readers that his carefully constructed bibliography represented actual sources, despite absence of any supporting evidence. This confusion intensified with the 1973 publication of the Necronomicon, the Book of Dead Names by Simon, presented as authentic translation of ancient Mesopotamian text. The work combined Lovecraft's fictional framework with genuine Sumerian mythology, creating hybrid grimoire that claimed historical legitimacy while incorporating invented elements. Publisher Schlangekraft, Incarn, marketed it as recovered occult document, complete with elaborate origin story about manuscript discovered in New York bookshop. The book became commercial success, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and remaining continuously in print for decades. Crucially, many purchasers treated it as functional magical text, attempting rituals described within despite its openly Lovecraftian content. The Simon Necronomicon demonstrated market appetite for fictional rituals repackaged as practical instruction, blurring boundaries between literary appreciation and occult practice. Occult practitioners' adoption of Lovecraftian entities presents complex case of deliberate fictional appropriation. Chaos magic, developed primarily by Peter Carroll and the Illuminates of Thanateros in the 1970s-80s, explicitly rejected distinction between real and fictional magical systems, arguing that beliefs' intensity mattered more than source material's historical authenticity. Chaos magicians incorporated Lovecraft's entities into their practice alongside traditional gods and demons, treating Nyarlathotep as egregore, thought-form entity given power through collective belief rather than independent existence. Phil Hines' Condensed Chaos, 1995, includes sections on working with Lovecraftian entities, providing ritual frameworks intentionally based on fiction, but approached as functionally effective. This practice acknowledges Lovecraft's inventions while claiming their psychodramatic utility, positioning the rituals as psychological tools rather than metaphysical procedures. Internet-era proliferation has generated unprecedented volume of ritual instructions claiming Lovecraftian origins. Creepypasta archives contain hundreds of supposed summoning procedures, often framed as found documents or leaked occult society materials. These range from obviously satirical, the Cthulhu summoning ritual, requiring pizza and Mountain Dew, to disturbingly earnest attempts at constructing working ceremonies based on story fragments. Subreddits, image boards, and paranormal forums host ongoing discussions about ritual methodology, participants debating proper pronunciation of relié, optimal astronomical conditions for summoning, and whether certain procedures genuinely produced effects. The anonymity and textual nature of online discussion enables performance of belief without commitment. Participants can claim to have performed rituals, report results, and maintain ambiguity about whether their accounts represent genuine experience, creative writing exercise, or deliberate hoax. The SCP Foundation represents formalization of collaborative Lovecraftian horror creation, transforming it from literary tradition into participatory mythology. Founded in 2008, the wiki-based project allows users to contribute documentation of fictional anomalous entities and objects, all framed as classified government records. Many SCP entries explicitly draw on Lovecraftian concepts, presenting entities requiring containment procedures resembling ritual in their precision and necessity. SCP-26662, for instance, presents Nyarlathotep-like entity that wants to avoid being worshipped, but keeps attracting cults through no fault of its own. Deliberate inversion of Lovecraft's premise. The project's success, thousands of entries, multiple adaptations, large dedicated fan base, demonstrates sustained appetite for cosmic horror frameworks and procedural containment summoning narratives. The SCP format essentially gamifies Lovecraftian horror, making ritual construction into collaborative creative exercise. Academic hoaxes and deliberate misinformation campaigns have contributed to ritual lore's proliferation. The Miskatonic University website, originally created as parody but elaborated into extensive fictional academic institution, provides course catalogs, faculty, profiles, and research archives, all treating Lovecraft's inventions as legitimate fields of study. Similarly, Various individuals have created fake historical documents, supposed medieval manuscripts referencing Nyarlathotep, fabricated archaeological reports describing temples dedicated to outer gods, manufactured correspondence between historical occultists discussing the Necronomicon. These hoaxes exploit digital documentation's ease of production and circulation, generating evidence that casual researchers might encounter and mistake for legitimate historical material. The phenomenon reveals interesting relationship between acknowledged fiction and functional mythology. Participants simultaneously know Lovecraft invented these entities and treat summoning procedures as potentially effective, maintaining what might be called productive cognitive dissonance. The rituals function culturally, not despite, but because of their fictional origins. Their lack of historical baggage makes them available for appropriation and modification in ways that established religious or magical traditions resist. A Catholic cannot easily modify the Mass. A chaos magician can freely adapt Nyarlathotep invocations. The fictional foundation becomes liberation rather than limitation, enabling experimentation and personal interpretation that historically grounded traditions would forbid. Film representations of Nyarlathotep rituals have struggled with Lovecraft's resistance to visual adaptation. Cosmic horror's effectiveness depending on suggested rather than shown threat. Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, 1963, ostensibly adapting Poe, but actually drawing heavily on The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, presents the most sustained early cinematic ritual sequence. The film shows Joseph Kerwin conducting ceremonies in candlelit basement laboratory, combining necromantic incantations with alchemical apparatus, a hybrid of medieval grimoire tradition and mad scientist aesthetics. The ritual's visual presentation, however, undermines cosmic horror's fundamental premise. Showing robed figures chanting around pentagrams reduces metaphysical dread to conventional occult imagery. The specific becomes generic, Lovecraft's carefully constructed ambiguity collapsing into recognizable horror film vocabulary. Cast a Deadly Spell, 1991, takes different approach, setting hard-boiled detective story in alternate 1948 Los Angeles, where magic functions as accepted technology. Nyarlathotep manifests as ultimate threat, with climactic ritual attempting to summon him through sacrifice, combining noir atmosphere with cosmic horror elements. The film treats magic procedurally. Rituals require specific components, follow reproducible steps, and produce consistent results like chemical reactions. This systematic approach mirrors gaming influences on 1990s horror, treating supernatural forces as operating according to discoverable rules. The Nyarlathotep summoning follows logical progression. Gather artifacts, perform geometric configurations, speak incantations at proper astronomical moment. The ceremony works, the entity begins manifesting, and only last-minute intervention prevents full materialization. The film thus presents successful ritual, suggesting that procedures function as described when properly executed. Interpretation antithetical to Lovecraft's original ambiguity about whether rituals work through genuine supernatural mechanics or psychological conviction. Gaming implementations have most thoroughly codified ritual procedures, requiring mechanical precision impossible in literary or film contexts. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG provides statistical frameworks for summoning ceremonies, spell difficulty ratings, sanity point costs, required time expenditure, failure consequences. Players learn actual procedures, not merely reading about rituals, but executing their game mechanical equivalents through dice rolls and decision trees. The game's Influence extends beyond immediate players. Call of Cthulhu reached 7 editions across 40 years, exposing hundreds of thousands of participants to systematize Lovecraftian ritual logic. Video game adaptations like Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, made rituals into gameplay mechanics. Players must memorize and correctly input geometric patterns and verbal formulae to cast spells, failure producing in-game consequences, paralleling madness mechanics from tabletop sources. Musical interpretations, particularly in metal and experimental genres, have treated Lovecraftian themes with surprising seriousness. The band Portal performs in hooded robes, their album titles, Outre, Vexovoid, suggesting cosmic horror themes, their aesthetic presentation deliberately evoking ritual atmosphere. Sun O. Drone metal incorporates elements of ceremonial performance. Concerts become endurance tests where volume and duration produce altered consciousness states resembling descriptions of ritual effects in Lovecraft's stories. Composer Cryo Chambers' ambient projects explicitly score Lovecraftian narratives, albums like Azathoth and Nyarlathotep, providing sonic interpretation of cosmic horror through subsonic frequencies and dissonant harmonics. These musical approaches suggest ritual as sensory experience, sound becoming incantation, performance transforming into ceremony, audience participation constituting collective summoning, whether literal or metaphorical. Interactive fiction and choice-based narratives explore ritual consequences through reader agency. Anchorhead, 1998, a text adventure set in Lovecraftian New England, requires players to investigate ancestral cult practices, gradually assembling ritual components and making decisions about whether to complete or disrupt ceremonies. The game's multiple endings depend on ritual choices, some paths leading to apocalyptic summoning, others to successful prevention. More recent works like Cultist Simulator, 2018, make ritual performance central gameplay loop. Players accumulate lore fragments, experiment with different ceremonial combinations, and face consequences of successful versus botched procedures. These games transform ritual from narrative element into interactive system, players developing experiential knowledge through trial and error rather than passive observation. Alan Moore's graphic novels The Courtyard, 2003, and Neonomicon, 2010, provide most explicit visual representation of Nyarlathotep rituals, presenting ceremonies including sexual components absent from Lovecraft's original work, but arguably implicit in his anxieties about bodily corruption and miscegenation. Moore's interpretation positions ritual as fundamentally transgressive act, violation of multiple boundaries simultaneously, epistemological, physical, moral. The graphic format enables precise visual depiction impossible in prose. Geometric patterns drawn in exact detail, ritual participants, expressions captured panel by panel, entities' manifestation shown through progressive distortion of visual space. Yet Moore maintains horror through conceptual rather than merely visual means. The rituals work by restructuring perception itself, making readers uncertain whether images represent objective events or corrupted narrator perspectives. Podcast drama, particularly shows like The Magnus Archives, 2016 to 2021, exploits audio medium's unique capacity for suggestion. Ritual sequences play out through voice acting, sound effects, and music, forcing listeners to construct mental imagery without visual reference. Episode 19, Confession, presents priest's account of failed exorcism that becomes inadvertent summoning, the audio design using reversed speech, overlapping voices, and subsonic rumbling to suggest impossible presences. The format proves ideal for Lovecraftian adaptation. Sound conveys wrongness without requiring definitive form, suggests spaces listeners cannot see, and maintains ambiguity about whether ritual effects occur objectively or in characters' deteriorating perceptions. The podcast's serial structure allows ritual consequences to unfold across multiple episodes, delayed effects building dread through narrative patience, impossible in film's compressed time frame. These adaptations collectively demonstrate that ritual's core appeal transcends medium, the procedural nature of ceremonies, the forbidden knowledge dimension, the tension between control and catastrophe all translate across different formats. Each medium emphasizes different aspects: film foregrounds visual spectacle, games stress systematic mechanics, music explores sensory immersion, prose maintains ambiguity. Yet all preserve fundamental structure, procedures that seem comprehensible yet produce incomprehensible results, knowledge that destroys rather than empowers, contact that transforms rather than merely enlightens. Chaos Magic's adoption of Lovecraftian entities represents most theoretically developed occult appropriation of fictional constructs. Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut, 1987, explicitly argues that all magical systems are equally fictional. Traditional deities possess no more objective existence than invented entities, their efficacy depending entirely on practitioner belief and psychological investment. From this perspective, Nyarlathotep functions identically to Hermes Trismegistus or Hecate, symbol systems for organizing consciousness and directing will. Carroll's International Order of the Illuminates of Thanateros incorporated Lovecraftian workings alongside more traditional ceremonial magic, treating the Necronomicon as valid grimoire regardless of its 1920s Rhode Island origins. The approach removes metaphysical claims while preserving psychological utility, positioning rituals as tools for exploring consciousness rather than methods for contacting external entities. The egregore concept provides theoretical framework for this practice. An egregore is thought form entity created through collective belief, gaining autonomous existence through sustained attention from multiple practitioners. Chaos magicians argue that sufficient cultural investment in Lovecraft's creations has generated genuine egregores. Nyarlathotep exists now as psychological entity inhabiting collective unconscious, accessible through ritual procedures, regardless of historical fabrication. Phil Hines' writings detail techniques for working with these entities, emphasizing that acknowledging fictional origins does not diminish ritual effectiveness. The practitioner simultaneously maintains awareness of construction while experiencing genuine psychological effects, productive doublethink, enabling both critical distance and immersive engagement. Literary scholarship on Lovecraft has evolved from genre dismissal to serious academic consideration, with corresponding attention to ritual elements' literary function. S.T. Joshi's comprehensive biographical and critical work, particularly H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, examines how Lovecraft's philosophical materialism shaped his fictional supernatural elements. Joshi demonstrates that rituals in Lovecraft's work function as narrative devices rather than metaphysical claims, their effectiveness within stories never reflecting authorial belief in actual supernatural forces. Yet this scholarly consensus has not prevented ritual appropriation. Knowing Lovecraft was atheist materialist, who viewed supernatural belief as intellectual failure, does nothing to discourage readers from treating his fictional ceremonies as practical instructions. Philosophy of horror's engagement with Lovecraftian themes has intensified in recent decades. Noel Carroll's The Philosophy of Horror, 1990, analyzes cosmic horror's unique structure, identifying how it generates affect through violation of cognitive categories, entities that are simultaneously alive and dead, organic and inorganic, natural and supernatural. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, positions cosmic horror as philosophical inquiry into world without us, reality indifferent to human existence. Thacker argues that Lovecraft's rituals represent attempt to contact this indifferent universe directly, ceremonies that succeed by revealing nature's fundamental hostility to human comprehension. The philosophical appropriation treats rituals not as magical procedures, but as thought experiments about knowledge's limits and anthropocentric bias. The Weird Studies movement, exemplified by the podcast of that name, launched in 2017, approaches Lovecraftian material through hybrid methodology, combining literary analysis, philosophy, psychology, and esoteric traditions. Hosts Phil Ford and J.F. Martell examine cosmic horror as serious intellectual tradition, deserving rigorous engagement rather than dismissal as pulp entertainment. Their discussions of Nyarlathotep rituals treat them as legitimate objects of study, analyzing their symbolic structure, cultural significance, and psychological effects without requiring belief in supernatural efficacy. This approach creates space for academic rigor while respecting material's aesthetic and conceptual power, refusing to reduce rituals to mere literary devices while avoiding occult literalism. Fan communities have generated extensive ritual lore through collaborative world-building. Online forums like Reddit's r Lovecraft and dedicated wikis accumulate interpretations, systematizations, and elaborations of ritual fragments from canonical texts. These communities develop internal expertise hierarchies. Users who have read extensively and can cite specific passages, connections between stories, and authorial intentions. The collaborative construction resembles scholarly activity, textual analysis, source comparison, debate about canonical versus non-canonical material. Yet conclusions often drift toward treating rituals as recoverable procedures, fan theorizing, generating detailed reconstructions of ceremonies Lovecraft deliberately left fragmentary. The communities thus function as distributed research projects, treating fictional source material with seriousness typically reserved for historical or religious texts. Religious studies perspectives have examined Lovecraftian rituals through comparative methodology, analyzing structural similarities with established ceremonial traditions. Rituals featuring geometric configurations parallel Tibetan mandala construction. Incantations in unknown languages resemble glossolalia in charismatic Christianity. Astronomical timing requirements mirror astrological traditions across multiple cultures. Sacrifice elements echo ancient Mediterranean and pre-Columbian practices. These structural parallels suggest Lovecraft drew on and synthesized genuine ritual components, even while inventing entirely fictional purposes and entities. The analysis reveals how fictional rituals achieve verisimilitude through incorporating recognizable elements from actual traditions, creating hybrid procedures that feel authentic despite novel contents. The post-truth connection has emerged in recent critical discourse, examining how cosmic horror resonates with contemporary epistemic crisis. When institutional authority collapses and competing truth claims proliferate without clear adjudication methods, Lovecraftian themes of knowledge-destroying revelation and reality's fundamental uncertainty gain disturbing relevance. Rituals attempting to contact Nyarlathotep parallel contemporary information seeking in algorithmically mediated environments, procedures promising revelation that instead produce disorientation, confusion, an inability to distinguish signal from noise. Mark Fisher's writing on The Weird and the Eerie examines how Lovecraftian aesthetics capture specific anxieties about agency and causality under late capitalism. Rituals representing feudal attempts at control within systems whose operations exceed human comprehension. These diverse engagements share common thread, treating Lovecraft's rituals as culturally significant phenomena deserving serious attention regardless of metaphysical status. Whether approached through magical practice, literary scholarship, philosophical inquiry, fan elaboration, or cultural criticism, the ceremonies generate sustained interest and interpretive effort. The rituals have achieved autonomous cultural existence, their significance exceeding their origins in 1920s-30s pulp fiction. They function as shared reference points, conceptual tools, aesthetic frameworks, and psychological metaphors, living elements of contemporary culture, despite everyone involved knowing they began as one author's inventions. This persistence demands explanation, which the final section will attempt to provide. The human need for narrative order around chaos explains much of these rituals' persistence. Randomness and meaninglessness prove psychologically intolerable. The mind compulsively generates patterns, causal explanations, and procedural frameworks even when confronting genuinely arbitrary phenomena. Nyarlathotep rituals provide exactly this structure. They suggest that cosmic horror operates according to discoverable rules, that contact follows reproducible procedures, that catastrophe results from specific causes rather than random misfortune. This proves paradoxically comforting. A universe where performing certain ceremonies summons terrible entities is more bearable than one where such entities arrive arbitrarily or not at all. The rituals impose narrative coherence on existential dread, transforming formless anxiety into structured threat that can be studied, documented, and theoretically avoided through proper precautions. Transgressive appeal operates at deep psychological level. Forbidden knowledge attracts precisely because prohibition marks it as significant. That which must be hidden supposedly contains power proportional to efforts expended concealing it. The ritual's fictional status does nothing to diminish this appeal. If anything, their acknowledged invention enables greater transgression since experimenting with them violates no actual religious or magical taboos. The practitioner can explore darkness without committing genuine sacrilege, maintain ironic distance while experiencing authentic psychological effects. This creates ideal conditions for what might be called recreational transgression, the thrill of breaking rules without actual consequences, though the line between recreational and genuine often blurs during sustained engagement. The cursed media phenomenon demonstrates rituals' migration into digital folklore. Creepypastas like the Russian sleep experiment or various cursed video game narratives follow Lovecraftian template, forbidden procedure, viewing certain content, performing specific actions, produces irreversible psychological contamination. These stories claim ritual origins. The sleep experiment, supposedly based on Soviet occult research, cursed games allegedly incorporating ritual elements into their code. The narratives present technology as ritual space, digital interaction as ceremony, information exposure as summoning. This framework resonates with contemporary experience of internet culture, where algorithmic feeds produce genuine psychological effects, where certain content genuinely disturbs, where information exposure sometimes feels like contamination. The fictional rituals provide metaphorical structure for actual anxieties about digital media's psychological impact. Existential dread in the Anthropocene finds expression through Lovecraftian ritual frameworks. Climate change operates on scales exceeding human comprehension, produces effects following scientific principles most people cannot parse, and results from collective actions no individual can control. Precise structure of cosmic horror. The rituals become metaphor for industrial civilization itself. Humanity performing elaborate procedures, fossil fuel extraction, industrial agriculture, global supply chains that function as inadvertent summoning ceremony, bringing forth consequences we can neither stop nor survive. The parallel proves uncomfortably exact. We know our collective actions produce catastrophic outcomes. We continue performing them anyway. We maintain illusion of control through technical language and scientific management, while actual trajectory remains towards systemic collapse. Contemporary climate anxiety thus maps perfectly onto Lovecraftian ritual logic, knowing the ceremony is catastrophic, yet feeling compelled to continue it. Technology as ritual illuminates another persistence mechanism. Algorithms, artificial intelligence systems, and complex computational networks operate according to principles most users cannot comprehend, producing results through processes that remain opaque even to their creators. Interacting with these systems resembles performing rituals. Input specific queries, follow particular procedures, receive outputs whose generation method exceeds understanding. Large language models generate text through billions of parameters no human can track. Recommendation algorithms shape perception through optimization functions operating at speeds precluding conscious oversight. Financial markets crash or surge based on high-frequency trading, executing faster than human cognition. These technologies function like Nyarlathotep manifestations. They respond to human input, operate according to discoverable patterns, yet their fundamental nature exceeds human comprehension. The rituals provide ready-made framework for conceptualizing this relationship. Archive anxiety and information overload create conditions where Lovecraftian themes resonate intensely. The internet contains more information than any individual can process, contradictory claims about every topic, and endless depths of increasingly disturbing content. Attempting to research any subject leads down rabbit holes where reliable information becomes progressively harder to distinguish from misinformation, satire, and deliberate deception. This mirrors structure of ritual investigation in Lovecraft's stories. The researcher seeking truth encounters texts that contradict each other, sources that may be authentic or fabricated, and knowledge that produces confusion rather than clarity. The contemporary information environment operates like distributed Necronomicon, vast repository of material that damages those who engage too deeply, where sustained attention produces disorientation rather than enlightenment. The question of why fictional rituals feel dangerous deserves sustained attention. Objectively, reading Lovecraft's stories poses no threat. No actual entities will manifest. No genuine psychological contamination will occur. The rituals remain safely contained within fictional framework. Yet readers report genuine unease, avoidance of certain passages, reluctance to recite invented incantations even in complete privacy. This response reveals something about how human psychology processes symbolic material. The rituals work as psychological constructs regardless of metaphysical status. Engaging with them activates genuine cognitive and emotional responses. Pattern recognition systems identify meaningful structure. Threat assessment mechanisms flag dangerous content. Memory systems encode and preserve information involuntarily. the fictional ritual becomes genuine psychological object, occupying mental real estate and producing measurable effects on consciousness. Why readers actively seek such material, despite or because of its disturbing nature, presents final puzzle. Horror consumption generally requires explanation, since it apparently contradicts hedonic self-interest. Why deliberately expose oneself to disturbing content? Theories range from arousal regulation, horror provides safe excitement, to coping mechanisms, rehearsing responses to threats, to meaning-making, confronting existential questions. Lovecraftian rituals serve all these functions simultaneously. They provide controlled danger, rehearsal for epistemic crisis, and framework for examining questions about knowledge, meaning, and human significance. The rituals allow exploration of territories that daily life usually cordons off. The possibility that understanding might be worse than ignorance, that consciousness might be burden rather than gift, that human existence might genuinely be cosmically irrelevant. These are thoughts most social contexts discourage, yet they demand engagement. The rituals provide socially acceptable container for dwelling on otherwise forbidden philosophical territory. The enduring power of these fictional ceremonies ultimately derives from their accuracy as metaphors for actual conditions. We do perform procedures whose consequences we cannot fully predict. We do pursue knowledge that produces anxiety rather than comfort. We do participate in systems we cannot comprehend or control. We do face potential catastrophes of our own making. The rituals simply make these patterns explicit, providing narrative structure for experiences that otherwise resist coherent framing. They persist because they remain useful, not as magical procedures, but as conceptual tools for thinking about contemporary experience. Lovecraft invented rituals for contacting Nyarlathotep in 1920s Providence. We continue using them because they help articulate 21st century anxieties that lack other adequate vocabulary. The fiction remains fictional, yet it captures something true about the human condition in late modernity, our predicament of possessing just enough understanding to recognize our incomprehension, just enough agency to feel responsible for outcomes we cannot prevent. The rituals for contacting cosmic indifference have become rituals we perform daily through simply existing in the worlds we have built. We are all summoners now, whether we acknowledge it or not.